Hoy tenemos como invitado a Thorsten Kraus, creo que lo pronuncié bien. Thorsten tiene un doctorado en sostenibilidad de la Universidad de Lund en Suecia, donde actualmente es investigador asociado. Y ha trabajado en temas de gobernanza en los bosques tropicales, en particular en el Amazonas, y hoy nos va a presentar su investigación sobre el Amazonas. Creo que es una investigación ongoing, ¿no? Entonces no es un paper final, es una investigación que está de hecho trabajando en este momento. Entonces también pues bienvenido, comentarios y preguntas, etc. La presentación de Thorsten va a ser en inglés, pero las preguntas y la discusión la podemos hacer en español. Thorsten habla perfectamente español, pero la presentación está en inglés, ¿vale? Entonces, pues muchas gracias y bienvenido a este seminario del CODS y EfD.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Hola. I'm going to switch over to English because the presentation is probably going to sound much nicer when I give it in English than in Spanish. But we can have any kind of doubts or questions in between or any comments in Spanish. It's not a problem at all. I'm very happy to be here today. It's my last day in Colombia. I'm leaving tomorrow after 3 months. And it's also a perfect timing, and I actually didn't realize it when we booked the date, because today is International Day of Forests. And right now in Sweden and Stockholm, or now it's actually kind of late already, but today there was a really important seminar in Stockholm in the Resilience Center about the future of the Amazon in the aftermath of the Bolsonaro elections in Brazil. So it's kind of really good to have this discussion here today as well a little bit. And I'm going to talk about forests. I'm going to talk about the Amazon because that's where I did a big chunk of my research in the past 10 years more or less. The title of my research, of my presentation today, is Hunting of Forest Fauna in the Amazon. I'm sorry there was a little bit of a mess up in the title when we sent it out, but I guess the main message was kind of evident. So I'm going to talk about challenges and implications for more sustainable governance of tropical forests. I'm going to give a short background introduction to why it's important to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about my ongoing research. So I'm not going to really show many finalized conclusions, but some potential points we can discuss, and also some preliminary conclusions that I found out in the last couple of years. Before I start, people always confuse Sweden with Switzerland, so I put a map up here, so that at least you are going to leave today and know where Sweden is, and that's not Switzerland. So I'm from the University of Lund. I'm actually German. I was born and raised in Berlin, but I moved to Sweden like 13 years ago after studying in Germany and in France. I studied economics back in the days, but then I made a transition towards more environmental studies and sustainability science. I'm a biologist by heart, so I really like biology and ecology, but actually that's not what I studied in the past. But I'm going back there. So Sweden is this big, long country up in the north of Europe. It's kind of cold at the moment still. Today is the official start of spring, but still it's only like 5 degrees. So it's kind of chilly. The University of Lund is the oldest university in Sweden. We just celebrated 350 years. So it's quite an old university. It's the biggest university as well. We have 40,000 students. And it's at the very south of Sweden, almost very close to Copenhagen. And I'm at the Center for Sustainability Studies, which is called Luxus. And I have a lot of really interesting, fascinating colleagues who work with urban governance, climate change policies, energy politics, agriculture, perennial agriculture, agroforestry, but also biodiversity. So if you ever are in Sweden, if you want to come and visit, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to receive you, and you can have a tour at Lund University, but also our center. And if you want to come and do a little exchange or visiting researcher, that's also possible. Just let me know. You're welcome. So it's actually, I didn't know that you're going to have this little roll up there, but that kind of fits my slide. You all have seen those, right? That's like the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which nowadays everybody talks about. There's lots of research programs starting up, looking at the different goals in itself, but also how they actually interlink and what the trade-offs are. Now, I think it's a very nice way to represent what the challenges are in the future, but I also think that the presentation shouldn't be like this, but it should be like this. Anyone has seen this before? This way? I think this is a more accurate way of actually presenting the importance of actually looking at these 17 development goals, that they actually stacked and not just like separated boxes next to each other. This actually clarifies or visualizes much better the different trade-offs that are there, but also that the economy that everybody talks about is very important. It's actually not as important if you don't have the bottom here working out really well. If you don't manage to actually protect the environment and move forward with more sustainable natural resource management, everything above that doesn't really matter because we won't achieve it anyways. So I like this presentation of the Sustainable Development Goals much more. And I wanted to show this because very often people have this box idea in mind, but I want to move away from this a little bit as well. So my talk today will last about 40 minutes. And if you have any questions in between, you can just raise your hand. If anything is unclear, you can also just let me know. And then I think we have plenty of time for a short, for a half an hour discussion or something like that. So before I start, I want to make sure that before you like all have your lunch or maybe get tired and fall asleep a little bit, hopefully not. But I want you to look at these main messages that I want you to take away from this talk today. And it's good to show these in the beginning, so I will show them later again, but it's better to have them now. So basically, what I would like you to take away from this talk today is that you think about forests in a different way. They're not just an assembly of just a number of trees on a given land, but they're actually a social ecological system. And it's important to recognize fauna, but also people in this as part of this ecosystem. Forest governance, and particularly if you talk about more sustainable ways of forest governance, has to involve local populations. And that's not really like rocket science. I mean, that's becoming more and more clear in the past couple of years. And it also has to support the development of productive alternatives to unsustainable practices, while also looking at what actually the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation really are. And they're often very far away from the places where we can actually observe deforestation itself. And that's really important as well, because many times I feel like in the past when I've been working in Ecuador during my PhD time, but also in Colombia and many other places, that sometimes it feels like we're actually like closing our eyes to the real drivers and looking at the deforestation and the campesinos and the local populations who are cutting down a tree, but actually not really acknowledging the big drivers, the political economy behind deforestation itself. And that, I think, is really important. My theoretical starting points for today are basically that forest conservation projects, something like RED Plus or conservation for incentives for conservation, that we find in many countries. And I studied in Ecuador, my PhD, I studied a program called Sociobosque. I don't know if you heard about this before. Very often only look at forest cover as an indicator for success. So we preserved 100 hectares, 1,000 hectares, 10,000 hectares. But that often is kind of misleading because you don't know what's going on under the canopy. And very often just having like a forest map as an indicator of this is conservation can be very wrong if you don't know what's actually going on in these forests and to what extent these forests are being degraded or are changing because of natural and anthropogenic processes. And particularly, that's what I'm going to focus on today, hunting. Hunting of forest fauna, also in RED Plus, actually is a threat to biodiversity conservation in the long run. I'm going to tell you about why. So there are some questions I will hopefully answer those in the next couple of minutes. And also in the long run, they might actually undermine carbon storage. And there's increasingly research showing that there's actually a very strong interlinkage between conservation of forest, biodiversity, and carbon storage. And in order to actually achieve a more equitable and effective forest governance, you can maybe even add efficient, but I don't think efficient is as important really. Recognizing and working with local indigenous people is really, really necessary and essential. Otherwise, we won't get there. So why is it important to talk about forests? I mean, now today is the International Day of the World's Forests, and more people at the International Climate Change Negotiations, the COP, but also at national levels are talking about forests. For a long time, forests have been seen as this like, oh, wasteland. It's like land that could be used for productive purposes. We have to cut down the trees, sell the timber, and convert it to like soybean plantations, palm oil, you name it. That's the way actually to have economic development. A forest in itself is not really in the traditional way contributing to economic development. It's actually like a wasted resource just standing there. This has changed in the last couple of years. Particularly in conjunction with climate change, people realize that actually deforestation and forest degradation are a tremendously large source of greenhouse gas emissions. And because we want to mitigate climate change, not all of us, but most of us in this room, I hope at least, we have to talk about forest and forest degradation and deforestation. And back in, actually 10 years ago, The Economist published a special issue on forests and why forests are really important for the economy, standing forests, not just like cutting down forests, and how forests can help to actually spur development and help to mitigate climate change, but also protect lots of ecosystem services that are really important for local populations, but also for populations who are really far away. But still, even though we talked about deforestation, and deforestation is a very important, or it seems like an important topic in international negotiations, not much is actually happening. If you really look at the numbers and if you look at the indicators, there's lots of deforestation. In Brazil, just yesterday, I think they published something that since the Bolsonaro government is in power, actually deforestation has increased tremendously. And you all know the pictures of Colombia as well, that since the peace agreement was signed, deforestation has also increased quite tremendously. Colombia was one of the countries with the lowest deforestation rates in South America before the peace agreement was signed. There was different reasons to that, but certainly like the peace agreement and the development that happened afterwards with the FARC retreating to camps and the lack of control in many local areas, people use the chance to actually go into the forest with the mentality of, in order to make it productive, in order to make something with these lands, we have to cut down the trees and we have to grow something or put some cattle on it in order to actually, gain access to land rights, but also to increase development. Or, that's a picture I was taking when I came back from fieldwork in 2017, that's in Guaviare. Other types of economic products, like illicit crops or cocoa plantations. So I'm not saying that deforestation itself is necessarily a bad thing. Deforestation is very almost natural to development. And I'm from Europe. Europe is a continent that was to a large extent deforested 200-300 years ago. We cut down all our forests. I'm from Germany. We have no natural forests left. All the forests you find in Germany, but also in Sweden, are actually highly managed and are planted. So nowadays, we have forests again. Germany has a 30% forest cover, Sweden has almost 70%, but these forests are managed forests. And that's only because we realized that, damn, we have actually cut down all our forests like 30 years ago. It was the only source of energy we could have. So this is a map of Europe showing like the trend of deforestation from the 1,000 years before Christ to 1850. And that would have actually even changed more since then. So you can see like particularly Central Europe, France, Spain, Germany has been, highly deforested. There was a saying in Germany in the 16th century, you wouldn't find a large enough tree to actually hang somebody because all the trees were really young, because they were always cut down quite rapidly for firewood. And if you look at the map today, and that's also what I mean when we look at maps and forest extent, they don't tell you what's really going on. If you look at the Global Forest Watch website, where they're tracking actually trends in forest cover, deforestation, forest loss, forest game, and also forest management, we can see that particularly, for example, Sweden and Finland with this violet color, which is an indicator of forest management. So all these forests are constantly intervened. There's constant forest management. These forests are by no means natural forests anymore. They're planted forests, and in the north of Sweden, they're even planting genetically modified trees from Canada to make them grow faster in this very cold climate. What does it mean? Well, it means basically we have to look what is going on under the canopy. If you really want to come by and talk about biodiversity conservation and forest, and if you want to understand to what extent the forest is actually a healthy forest. And there it's important to look at not just the forest from above, but also go and actually check what's going on in these forests and how are people who are living in or close to these forests actually interacting with the different parts of the ecosystem, with the fauna, with the trees, even with the fish, which is also important for tree dispersal. Now, at the same time, we are talking about deforestation and halting deforestation, forest degradation, but we're also talking about biodiversity conservation. And there's more and more research showing, the trends are not necessarily very good, that we're losing a lot of biodiversity all over the world. Not just in the tropics, but particularly in the tropics, where it's quite serious. And this paper was published, I think, in Science in 2017, showing the threat to the world's primates, like monkeys. Right? And it says that more than half of the world's primate species are actually endangered. And in some regions, for example, in Madagascar, all populations of primates are declining. In the neotropics where we are, it's about 63 of the populations are declining, and 36 of the species that we find in neotropics are actually endangered. So why is it important to talk about primates? Anyone? Why do monkeys matter? They're funny. It's nice to have them, right? But they're actually really important they taste good. Some people say, I've never tried. But monkeys are really important in tropical forests because they're seed dispersers. Monkeys are one of the most important species when it comes to seed dispersal in tropical forests. And if you have a forest where there's a healthy monkey population, but depending on the species, this is like, I'm not going to go into biology, of course, not all monkey species are the same, but if you have a healthy population of primates, trees that are relying on these primates for seed dispersal can actually disperse their seeds all over the forest in a much better way and actually have a higher chance of germinating and of growing up to an adult tree. If you don't have primates, but if you only have other types of species who are seed predators, the tree that once relied on dispersal actually can't disperse its seeds. So all the seeds are falling down under the tree. Most of them are going to die. So the tree over long run can't reproduce in the forest. So this species of tree that's relying on primates will actually disappear in the long run if there's no dispersal. Or it's highly likely it's going to disappear. So monkeys are really important, but not just monkeys or other species. And of course, along with other species in tropical forests, monkeys are hunted for food, they're hunted for pets, or they just disappear because basically forests are fragmented, there's pollution, there's people moving in, cutting down large trees that actually the monkeys are relying on food. There's many reasons why these species are disappearing, but hunting in many parts of tropical Africa is one of the main factors. Now in Colombia, and I don't know to what extent you are thinking about hunting here in Colombia, hunting is actually really pervasive in the country. And there's a study published in 2016 by a friend of mine who was a co-author. And what they did, they went into different regions. They went into the Amazonas, in Guainía, this is Casanare, Chocó, but also in the north, looking at the markets and what kind of species you would find in these markets. And of course, in Colombia, commercializing wild species is illegal. So it's not very easy to go to market and just find tortuga or una danta or something like that. But if you are spending some time with the sellers and if you're actually developing some personal relationships, they might disclose what they actually have or what you can buy. And to this way of research, people found that actually there is a flourishing wildlife market in Colombia. That's for food, mostly for consumption. Some of it is for pets, but mostly it's for consumption. And a study published by the same team in the border region between Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, and the Amazonas, and Leticia, and the Puerto Nariño, found that per year there's an estimated 433 tons of wild meat being commercialized. And that's just the meat that's commercialized. That actually is the meat that goes to the market. There's much more that actually stays in communities, that stays in families, and is being consumed. So that's quite a lot. I'm not saying that it's bad or that it's good. I'm not making a judgment. There is quite a lot, and there's so little we actually do understand. Because it's illegal, because trade is illegal, it's very hard to study that. And people are very reluctant to actually disclose information. But it's important to do that because if we don't do it, we will not understand what's going on under the canopy in these forests and how people are actually using resources and what effect it might have on the ecosystem itself, but also on people's food security in the long run. So why is there hunting of wild fauna? What is many reasons for that. In the past, maybe you heard about something that's called tigrilladas. There was a flourishing boom of pelts in the Amazon after the rubber boom from the 1930s to 1970s, where hundreds of thousands of jaguar skins, peccary skins, caiman skins were actually taken away and were exported to markets in North America and in Europe. Some of this was used for clothing, like fashion. Back in the days. And that happened until the 70s, until actually it was made illegal by CITES and by different countries that actually passed some laws. So there's some estimations of how much was actually coming out. There's an interesting paper by Atunes in 2016 in Nature, trying to estimate that from data that they found in Manaus and in other port cities in Brazil. But probably they say the estimations that we make are much lower than actually what was really hunted. And for example, to hunt one jaguar, you need about 10 or 20 monkeys that you hunt as a canada in order to attract the jaguar. But these monkeys will not come up in the statistics. So the impact of what happened back then is still observable nowadays in some regions in the Amazon. But nowadays, people don't hunt anymore for skins. They hunt mostly for food. So wild meat in some communities in the Amazon is a really important source of nutrition. And it's actually really good quality food. It's actually much better than pollo congelado or embutidos. It has much more nutritional value, and it's also much more readily available, and it's for free. You don't have to pay for it. If you live in El Esguardo in Colombia, if you're an indigenous person, you can actually hunt legally, and it's for free. You don't have to pay someone to hunt. All you have to do is you have to invest time. You have to buy some batteries. You have to maybe get an escopeta, a firearm. And get some shots, that's mostly what you have to invest in order to go hunting. Or you hunt traditionally with now I'm mixing up Spanish, trampas. Yeah. Trampas or with cebatanas, the old-fashioned way. That's cheaper. But people also hunt for medicine, ritual objects, or in order for protection. That's a picture I took in 2017 where I was doing an interview in the community and there was a jaguar who basically walked in and was hunting dogs in the community. And then what they did is in order to protect the kids, they run after a jaguar and killed it. Because that's very unusual. Usually they wouldn't do that, but because a jaguar was a threat to personal life, they had to kill it. So these things happen nowadays. So what I want you to really think about and take away is that if you look at forests, we have to think about these things. We also have to think about to what extent hunting and species are actually interacting with this ecosystem, because everything is interconnected. And in the long run, there's ecological interconnections that are going to be broken if, for example, some species disappear. And there's actually so little we do know. I mean, biologists are constantly studying and finding out new things, and tropical forests are highly complex ecosystems. So there's very little we actually can surely understand how these ecosystems function. Then if you add people to it, it makes it more complicated. And if you add politics to it, it makes it even more complicated. But we shouldn't actually, because of that, refrain from studying these ecosystems and these social ecological systems. And if you see, I forgot to tell you, this is a study done in Brazil where they actually had a forest plot where they were excluding certain types of animals from the forest. And they actually tried to study, okay, what happens to seed dispersal in the long run? What happens to certain trees in the long run, tree species? And they concluded that if you take away some seed dispersers like una boruga, lapa, Corniculus paca, or una danta, un tapir, or for example, big primates or toucans, and other birds, the forest will slowly change. These are like long-term processes. It doesn't happen today or tomorrow or next week. It will happen over many years. But what they conclude is that the forest will change, and many of the larger trees that are relying on animals for seed dispersal will actually disappear. Now, what this means for REDD+ and for carbon storage is that with these trees disappearing, not just the forest is going to be a poorer ecosystem with less tree diversity, but also carbon storage will actually, or might decline. There's still a preliminary conclusion. Some studies say yes, and some say no, it's not so sure. But there is highly substantial evidence that it might actually impact carbon storage in the long run. And forest resilience, how these forests are actually able to cope with climate change and other kind of environmental stresses. So it's not just important because the animals are disappearing and diversity is disappearing in animal species, but also the forest will change. And this affects people, because people will no longer find food, they will no longer be able to maybe eat the fruits of these trees that the species would actually disperse naturally through ecosystem services, as you would call it. However, what still happens is that forests are looked at from a very technical perspective. Now, I come from a country, from Germany, where actually forestry science was kind of like developed or invented many years ago. And that was because we didn't have any forests, so people were like, oh, now we have to plant forests. How do we do it the best way? How do we make forest management most efficient? How can we produce most timber in the shortest amount of time? And that is still how many forest engineers would actually approach a forest. How can we make forests most efficient to produce what we want? And that's usually timber. And nowadays also, how can we make forests in a way that actually we can store the most amount of carbon in that forest? Now, these things don't necessarily equal in natural forest or primary forest. They can actually be highly managed forests, like we see in Sweden. And many of the definitions of forest actually reflect that kind of thinking still today. They talk about forests as just a number of trees on a certain land that are able to grow 5 meters or more and might cover 10 or 30% of land. That's it. And most of the definitions, and there's hundreds of them, they don't mention animals and they don't mention people. So it's a very technical, very particular way of looking at forests. And that's very strong till today. And that actually is reflected in the way we manage forests. And in Sweden, I work also on a project on Swedish forests, and that's still very much there. The Swedish forestry companies, which own lots of forests and very powerful, they don't see forests as a social ecological system. They see it as trees that need to be harvested every 30 or 40 years in different rotation cycles, and that's it. So it takes time to actually change that paradigm. It's happening slowly, but it still is a very slow process. So what we did, me and a colleague from Copenhagen University, we looked at to what extent, for example, one could see this kind of discourse, this very technical way of approaching forests also in REDD+ documents and national programs. So we selected 5 countries, partly because we work in these countries and we have some experience. We selected Colombia, Ecuador, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. So we looked at the national REDD+ documentation and to what extent these documentations actually talk about biodiversity or biological diversity, how they actually talk about forest fauna as a part of biodiversity, and if they mention hunting in relation to REDD+. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that biodiversity is always mentioned because you can't talk about forest without biodiversity. That's politically incorrect, so we have to do it. But actually, they never really go into detail what biodiversity means. They don't mention tree diversity or animals or fauna. They only mention biodiversity. There's only very few national documents who actually mention forest fauna, and only like one which actually mentions hunting as a potential risk to biodiversity and forests that are to be included in national REDD programs. This is research that we hopefully have to do the reviews, but we're hopefully publishing this soon. So maybe it's going to be out there in a couple of weeks. So my research, coming from that experience in Ecuador, where I looked at this conservation incentive scheme that was created by the government, I realized that even the national government of Ecuador, giving out incentives to local populations for forest conservation, they don't think about hunting or forest fauna. They have this very top-down approach of, if we have 100 hectares of forest protected, that's a conservation success. While I was working in these communities, I was working with people there, and I was doing interviews on the socioeconomic impacts of these conservation incentives on, and I realized that, so wait a second, so you have this forest reserve that the government is paying for, but this reserve, you're telling me that there's no animals in this reserve. They're all hunted out. And I started thinking about it. So what happens to these forests? I talked to the government, and I realized that hunting is not featured. People don't think about these connections. And that's when I started to write a proposal and wanted to investigate more on hunting, like how hunting actually, what happens under the canopy, how can we study that? And since I come from a bit of economics and also in governance, I wanted to look at, okay, so how does hunting feature in forest governance in Colombia, also in Ecuador, but I'm focused on Colombia. I want to understand what drives hunting behavior in local populations. So why do people hunt? Is it really just the food, or is it something else? And how the actually hunters in local communities are developing regulations or norms for hunting. Do people actually talk about how they should hunt? Do they actually are they aware of declining populations? Do they actually have a mindset of more sustainable hunting in the long run? So what is going on there? And then I also started to include traditional ecological knowledge. Have you heard about this? Probably some of you have. So to what extent traditional ecological knowledge that was or still is very important in many, particularly indigenous communities, but also non-indigenous communities, can be potentially included in creating a more holistic and sustainable way of forest governance from the local level to the regional to the national level. This is where I am. So you can already see maybe from my introduction that I'm very interested in actually seeing the elephant, not just parts of it. Because universities are very slow to develop, and it's really good to have these interdisciplinary programs and interdisciplinary initiatives that actually try to draw on biology, on legal scholars, economics, political science, and so on, to actually try to understand this absolute messy world we live in. You can't just do that from looking at it from one angle. You have to look at it from many different angles, and you have to work in interdisciplinary teams together to do it. Otherwise, we might find solutions, but they're usually never the real solution to a problem. So I was interested in looking at the real elephant, the big elephant, not just the trunk or the tail or the back of it. And then also seeing okay, how is this elephant situated in the larger landscape? This is a metaphor, so I'm not actually studying elephants, but it's just, this is a famous picture. I hope you've seen this before, how blind people, approach an elephant. Now this is a really complex task, and I'm by no means, I always feel like I'm actually at the limit. There's always more one should read into anthropology, history, political science, legal studies, and so on. But it's a very exciting, for me personally, I realize this is the most exciting way of doing my research. So this is where I am, and this is what I'm trying to now show you a little bit of how far I've come. So I've been doing research in Colombia now for the last 2 years, 1.5, 2 years. I work a little bit with the indigenous reserve, the Resguardo Indígena, in the Middle Caquetá. It's kind of large. I mean, I come from Europe, right? So these territories in the Amazon is absolutely large to me. The Amazon of Colombia is as big as Sweden. And if anyone has been to the Amazon here in this room, okay, quite a few. And I'm always fascinated how little Colombians actually know about the Amazon. Like I have a personal interest, so I've been there many times, but if you talk to, my wife is from Colombia, and if I talk to her family, none of them has been to the Amazon. And if I ask if they can name like 2 or 3 indigenous ethnicities in the Amazon, they can't. And I find that kind of sad because Colombia is such a highly diverse country, not just biologically, but also culturally. And it's sad that there is such a closed, I always say like that the Amazon seems to be so far away. And that's also explained by history. It's an area of colonization. It's a frontier area. It used to be only an area where you can extract resources. And that's still today. And it's sad because if Colombians would go to the Amazon a bit more and if actually would maybe like engage with people, that they would realize how the politics in Bogota, for example, shape people's life in these regions and how, for example, the new Plan de Desarrollo Nacional with the mining projects and so on actually has potentially devastating consequences on these areas. Anyhow, so I went to the Middle Caquetá in the summer of 2017 with a colleague. Quite an adventure to get there. You have to fly from San Jose Guaviare with a cargo plane with an old DC-3. We were there for a couple of days. I was talking to the leadership and to the shaman about how we can potentially study hunting in this area. Now it's very politically laden, it's very complicated to do these things in resguardos indígenas. You work with resguardos, you know that it's not always very easy. But it was very enlightening to me, and I continued working with the local knowledge holder for a couple of months, and still today I'm working with him. Now this resguardo indígena is really big, not as big as the other ones, but it's as big as Luxembourg, the country of Luxembourg in Europe. It's 250,000 hectares. And they have 300 people living in this resguardo. So that's, I mean, we talk about very low population densities. So I came to the conclusion that studying the effects of hunting there is probably, I mean, it's important, but probably hunting has a very low impact in these areas because they're so big, there's so many areas that are very far away. You won't really find much. People do hunt danta, peccary and so on, but mostly for personal consumption because there's also no larger urban market close by. There's no big town close by. So you're actually not exporting it. Not today, the last couple of months I spent a few weeks close to Leticia in Puerto Nariño in Resguardo Ticoya. That's where I felt like hunting is more pervasive, and I'm going to share some of the results with you as well. So when you work in All right. So in the resguardo in the Middle Caquetá, lots of research has been done in the past together with Tropenbos International. I don't know if you heard about Tropenbos International. They have an office in actually very close to here. And they've been working a lot with fisheries. So there's a huge inventory on fisheries. And actually that's really interesting because fisheries seems to be studied much more in the Amazon than actually hunting. And the reason for that is that fisheries or fishing is legal. So it's much easier to actually do monitoring on fishing because fish is exported to Leticia, to other markets, even to Bogota from the Amazon. So there's lots of research being done on fishing, but not on hunting. And in the resguardo in the Middle Caquetá, I was really interested to talk to the shaman, who's still kind of like a very prominent and important figure, to what extent traditional ecological knowledge, the knowledge that actually has developed and has been created over centuries in these areas by indigenous people, actually still is in place today. To what extent do people still follow these traditional rules of when you can hunt a certain animal, when you cannot hunt a certain animal? How do you have areas that are sacred, that you're not allowed to go hunting, for example, salt licks, salados, and how do they actually manage the hunting? That is quite important because there's more and more research being done on to what extent traditional ecological knowledge can help us today to develop better conservation strategies or better forms of natural resource management and governance. And it doesn't have to be only like in the tropics. There's lots of research being done by Burkes, who is a professor in Canada, in Manitoba, how this actually is also playing out in the United States and in Canada and in Sweden as well. How people who lived in these areas, who actually are the experts and to know these environments much better than any biologist who comes from a big town or comes from somewhere else, how these actually have developed practices that allow us to manage these ecosystems in a much more sustainable way. So there was a famous Colombian, I think he was Austrian originally, but he moved to Colombia in the 60s and 70s, Reichel Domatov. Anyone heard about him? So he studied, for example, traditional ecological knowledge among the Tucano indigenous group in Orinoquia and in Guayania. And he says that if you really are looking into these traditional norms and traditional rules that are developed by these indigenous groups, you can actually see that these cosmologies and myth structures, together with the ritual behavior that has developed there, are actually some kind of like ecological principles that we should document, that we should maintain in order to actually today develop conservation strategies or management strategies that allow us for more sustainable use of these ecosystems and these environments. Now, what happens though is that knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, is rapidly disappearing. In Colombia, for example, you have about 100 different ethnicities, and at least half of them are going to disappear. The language is going to disappear very rapidly, and with that language and with the traditional management and traditional way of seeing the territory, we lose in tremendous wealth of knowledge. And that is very sad because there's so much knowledge out there that has not been documented, or if it's been documented, it's in some obscure books, or it's very rarely actually taken into consideration by experts, by academics, but also by governments. This is a map that was developed by Uldarico Matapi, who is the traditional knowledge holder in the Resguardo Nonuya Villa Azul in Miguel Caquetá. And this is just an example, for example, how they envision the territory. So the territory now, even though they have a resguardo that's defined, there are some legal limits to how big the resguardo is, that by no means actually reflects how they actually view the territory. The territory is much larger than that. The resguardo is a political entity that has to be put in place in order to claim legal rights to a certain piece of land. But anyone who's been studying indigenous ethnicities in the Amazon knows that historically these communities have moved around, and there was a rubber boom, communities were displaced, many of them disappeared. So what you see nowadays is by no means actually the ancestral lands that these traditional societies actually had. And he made this map, and this map covers more than 400 kilometers of the Rio Caquetá, which is this one, up to the Rio Abaporis here. And that's a map that he drew from his mind and said, like, well, this is a map that we use and actually to visualize the territory. We don't talk about just our resguardo, no, and the territory is much larger and there's interconnections. And also to visualize where the traditional owners of the owners of the terrestrial world of the different species actually live. And these are like places that are important. These are very sacred places. They used to be sacred places, not anymore. These are places that are very important because they say like any type of intervention, any type of hunting, for example, needs to be discussed previously with the owner of the territory, with the owner of the species. You cannot hunt an animal without actually asking for permission. And there's lots of these like rules that used to exist in the past that actually prevented people from overhunting. For example, there are certain beliefs, or there were beliefs, that the spirits of game animals, for example, the danta, the tapir, which is a very important one because it's the largest mammal in tropical forest, so it's a very important animal, not just because it's lots of meat, but also it symbolizes much more spiritually. If you violate these rules, you violate these norms, you actually are at risk of getting sick. So sickness and disease in people is not actually something that is because you're having a bacteria, it's actually because you have misrespected or disrespected the environment, disrespected the owners of the resources, and you haven't asked for permission, or you have hunted in a certain place where you're not allowed to hunt, or at a certain time of the year where you're not supposed to hunt. There's also lots of taboos still when it comes to food. A pregnant woman is not allowed to eat certain types of meat. A young child is not allowed to eat certain types of meat as well, mostly fish, but only depending on the season. You're not allowed to eat certain types of meats in some seasons because the meat is not healthy. And that's actually ecologically proven that sometimes the animals are very skinny, they might be more sick than other times because there's not enough food in the forest available, there's not enough fruits available. So the meat and the abundance and also the healthiness of the meat changes according to season. Now these type of like regulations used to be very strong in the past, but they have been, of course, disappearing with modern technology, with the onset of a market. For example, in the Middle Caquetá, there was lots of mining in the past couple of years, not so much right now, but in the past there was lots of gold mining. So with gold mining, there was a huge increase in demand for meat. So people would go and say like, wow, I need money, I go and hunt a danta and I sell it to the mining boys. So there was some kind of commercial hunting going on in the past, not because there's a market somewhere close by in a town, but because there was some kind of demand from people who come and extract resources. And what we did is also, so we did joint work together with Uldarico to actually develop a long list of important forest fauna So not actually working with species who live in the water, but mostly by the terrestrial fauna, mostly primates and other type of mammals. And to what extent these different species actually play an important role in traditionally in the management of the indigenous community. So how actually people were using these species, to what extent there's certain rules and regulations around the species, what they use them for, but also to document the names of the species. So the idea is to work with that. That's a preliminary result that we have, but the idea is to use that and work with that a little bit more in the future. And what we want to do, what I haven't done yet, but what we want to do is to develop an ecological calendar around which time of the year certain species are okay to eat and where you can hunt them and how, but when you should actually not hunt them according to traditional rules, according to traditional ecological knowledge. That's a calendar that was developed along the Rio Valpes in, I think it was in Brazil, just at the border to Colombia. And that's just an illustration of how these ecological calendars look like. So in the Amazon, because seasons are they vary, and depending on the water levels of the rivers, and depending if there's a dry season, short dry season, but also much more depending on the fruiting seasons of certain trees. And that's important because if you go back to the image of the primates and where primates matter for the forest, I think it's important to understand the relationship that many of these species have with certain flowering or fruiting trees to actually understand to what extent these species rely on pollination, but also on seed dispersal by different species. And hunting has an impact then on the dispersal of the trees and on nutrition of families. So there was one. The second study site that I just introduced very briefly before is the Resguardo Indígena Ticoya, which is in the triple frontera area of Colombia and the Amazon. Anyone has been there to Puerto Nariño? Yeah? Okay. So Puerto Nariño, which is this very small, nice touristy town, more and more tourism coming there, is actually kind of the center of the Resguardo Indígena. But the Resguardo Indígena has 21 communities along the Rio Amazonas, but also along the Rio Amacayacu, along the Rio Loreto Yaco. So what I did there is that I knew that there was quite some research being done on hunting and on the amount of trade in wild meat in these areas. And what I did now, when I just came back a week ago actually, I went to visit all the communities where there were hunters who were registered in the first hunting association that I know of, at least in Colombia, to talk to them why they are part of this association, how they actually conduct hunting, and what kind of challenges they're facing. Now, this association is called Airumakuchi. Anyone? No? You know what this is? Ah, cool. So for me, I never heard of a hunting association. And the reason is that hunting, because it's illegal in Colombia, and hunters are usually stigmatized. So when I come as a tourist or when I come as a conservation NGO, and I hear that someone is hunting at Danta or like on Mico, then I would be like, oh my God, like you cannot hunt animals. Hunting wild animals is a very sensitive, very polemic discussion to be had with many people. And I find that fascinating because I say like, well, what's better? Is it not better to hunt a tapir every once in a while in a piece of forest, or is it better to cut down the forest and put a cattle on it? So what's ethically more correct? What's environmentally better? What's socially better? I personally think that hunting, sustainable hunting in forests is much better than cutting the forest down and putting cattle on it. Because then you have nothing. You don't have the biodiversity, you don't have the forest, you don't have the carbon. So I think it's really important I think it's very fascinating and interesting to study how these people, these hunters in these communities have got together, created an association, what kind of challenges they're facing, and how they're actually trying to then negotiate with the authorities about their hunting. That they actually are trying to make the hunting a bit more legal. They want to have a stronger negotiation power in order to commercialize some of the hunting within the communities and within the resguardo, not to other markets, but within the resguardo. And they did that because they realized that if they don't do it, then there's a threat that many of the animals are going to not disappear, but they're going to be much harder to find. So what you typically find around communities, particularly where you have a larger population, people will tell you that many of the animals you used to hunt in the past, they're still there, but they're much harder to find. So people had to invest much more time in order to get out there and actually find a peccary or a tapir or something. And that's, of course, not good for the hunter. Hunting in itself is already it's challenging enough. It's dangerous. You might get bitten by snakes. It happens a lot. You might break a leg. You might get attacked by a jaguar, which also happens once in a while. So hunting is a dangerous activity. Some people like to do hunting. I talk to hunters who say like, I love hunting. I'm not a good fisherman, but I like hunting. So they say like, I don't like hunting at all. I don't go out into the jungle at midnight and get bitten by a snake. No, no. But it's good for them to have animals come close. And it's also good for them to actually develop some kind of system where they can talk to each other and manage the hunting that they're doing. And also because they want to actually say that, they want to portray to the authorities that hunting is not a bad thing. If it's well managed, if it can be sustainable, and that's the tricky question, it's a challenging question, what is sustainable here, it's not a bad thing. It can actually be quite a good thing for personal, for nutrition, for food, but also because it actually continues a cultural tradition that otherwise will be lost. And hunters, if you're ever into the forest with a hunter, I mean, they're the most amazing guides you'll ever have because they see things that you will never see. And they are so much more aware of the environment. They know how animals behave. They know the trees. They know where the certain fruit trees are. That knowledge will be lost or is at risk, of danger of getting lost if, for example, hunting is further stigmatized and seen as something that should not exist any longer in the future. So they have come together and they have developed internal guidelines, which they're working on. So I'm not saying this is like, it's not perfect at all and there's lots of issues. I talk to the hunters, they say like, yeah, we know these guidelines, but if I don't hunt this animal here, then they will hunt it further down there, so I might as well just hunt it here. So there's lots of problems, and I'll talk a little bit about this. So what they have actually come up are some internal guidelines so far that are not written in stone. They're guidelines, and they're not always respected, but they say like, well, we have to talk about quantities. We're not supposed to hunt too much. What is too much? No one really knows. We're not allowed to hunt every day. That's probably a good thing. We're not allowed to hunt pregnant females. That's really important. But if you're a hunter and you're hunting at night, it's very hard to know if a certain individual is pregnant or not. They usually only know that once it's dead and once they open the belly. We're only allowed to hunt 2 or 3 animals per group if it's a peccary. Peccaries live in large manadas, so you're not allowed to kill 10, but only 2 or 3. But if there's 10 hunters and everybody kills only 2 or 3, you still kill quite a lot of the group. What they have done is they have planted more tree species that are important food sources for animals like for boruga, for certain monkeys, for birds, in their chagras, in the agroforestry plots. So they want to bring the animals close, and they have done it 2-3 years ago, and they say that, well, already now, because there's less people hunting, but there's also less cutting of wood that used to be in the past, animals are coming close, and that's a good thing. The people have to spend less time on hunting. And they have to very be quite dangerous for the hunter itself because you might actually kill another hunter if you encounter someone at night. And that actually has happened because you don't always see very well in the rainforest. So if you think you see an animal, people often fire without actually really checking if it's an animal. So it might actually be a person, and that's really dangerous. So preliminary conclusions from this research is that the problem with this association right now is that they're operating in a collective land that is accessible and open to everybody who lives in this resguardo. And it's actually an open access regime. So there are some kind of restrictions, but no one follows these. And it's also because the hunters have told me, like, if we don't do it here, they do it over there. And if they do it over there, then they get the income, they get the money, but we don't. So there is actually a disincentive for an individual hunter to follow the rules because there is no global contract that is actually respected and controlled and enforced by someone who has the power to do so. And the same with timber. So animals and timber, and that, like most of the resguardos, are actually a common property. So everybody can go and hunt an animal. All I need is a gun or a trap or something, and then I can do so. And it's everybody's bank account as well. And people see animals and timber as very important in the territory, of course, but they also see it as, well, that's money standing right there. And if I need to pay school fees, or if I need to buy medicine, or if I need to buy food, like rice or sugar, well, then I have to go cut down the tree and sell it. Or I have to go and kill an animal and sell the meat that I won't consume myself. And that's because there's an absence of alternatives. And that is in Puerto Nariño, where there are actually some alternatives. There's actually there's a market, there is some kind of job opportunities, very limited though, and there's tourism, so there are some alternatives. But if you go to communities much further away, then the only bank account that is there is basically the natural resources that is available in the forest. They also said like, well, yeah, we still like hunting, and most of the hunters are between 40 and 60. But they said like, none of our kids likes to hunt anymore. They have their cell phones, they go to school somewhere else, they might actually go to stay the entire week or an entire month somewhere, Porto-Nariño or in Leticia. So the knowledge that we have cannot be conveyed to our children. Not just because they're not here, but also because they don't want to anymore. They don't really want to go out in the forest. And yes, walking in the forest for 5-6 hours at night is hard, and it's not necessarily a nice thing to do. It's exciting, but it's not a nice thing to do, if you're not used to it at least. So with that disappearance, you lose tremendous amount of knowledge. And that, as a scientist, actually, I think is really important to recognize, because there's so much knowledge out there that people understand these ecological relationships that we as scientists are only starting to actually uncover. There's so much we can learn from them. And also the way people actually look at conservation. So say conservation, the traditional way of conservation, by just putting a fence around it and kicking people out and just you have to protect, you're not allowed to touch, is not the way forward. We are living here. We've been using these resources for a long time. So for us, conservation is actually using, but within limits, respecting, but using. If you don't use certain animals, if you stop hunting certain animals, then what value is there for us? They will disappear from our culture. They will disappear from our mindset, and then they actually are going to extinct. Not because they're physically going extinct, but they're actually going to extinct from the way we live and from the way we actually manage the territory. So I think that's a very interesting way of relating conservation, maybe finding, like opening up a new discussion on what conservation actually means for people. But then you have these challenges that exist if you live in an area where actually there are three countries. Every country has a different way of managing natural resources. And if you live close to Peru, where there is almost no control, and if you go to any market in the Peruvian Amazon, you will find anything that you can imagine that actually lives in the forest sliced up on a table ready for consumption. So if you go, and in Brazil the same, I went to Benjamin Constant to the market, and you find danta, you can find caiman, you can find paujil, which is a big bird, you can find tortugas, you can find deers, you can find peccary, you can find boruga openly. So it's there. So if you live in an area where the border exists, but it's very open, everybody can just go back and forth, and where there is actually quite a big trade in wild meat, then it's very difficult to implement any kind of restriction. People have told us, because they're living close to the Peruvian border, they're like, well, if we don't hunt the peccaries here, we as Ticoyas say we're not going to hunt certain animals. Animals are very mobile. They move into Peru. They're going to get slaughtered over there in Peru. So if we don't do it here, they will be killed over there. So there is really a need for working much more closely with other countries and actually managing natural resources and coming further when it comes to hunting. But then there's also the larger politics of conservation, of course. And Colombia, I think right now is a really interesting example, because you receive so much money from countries like Norway, Germany, the UK for protecting the Amazon, like Visión Amazonía or Corazón Amazon, I don't know what it's called. Visión Amazonía is a really interesting case, for example, where the Prime Minister of Norway comes to Leticia, close to Leticia, visiting a community with Santos, where you have this very nice, picturesque indigenous group dressed up in traditional clothes, which you actually never see, only when there's tourists coming. And then congratulating each other on this like nice collaboration where Norway is giving millions of dollars to Colombia fighting deforestation. Now, that are like top-down policies from states, not even from the Colombian state, but also from international partners like Norway, who have a certain objective with that. I mean, you all know that Norway makes a lot of money by selling oil, big contributor to climate change, and then they use some of that money, some of that profit, and divert it to Colombia to say like, oh, now you need to protect your forest because we have to mitigate climate change. And I personally find that very contradictory, to be at best. And also because when you talk to people, or I talk to a few people about this, they often have no idea what conservation, what Plus is, or what Visión Amazonía is doing. It's like, yeah, we heard about this, but never really, no one comes here, no one sits down with us and talks to us. So they're talking about our territories, they're talking about our land, they're talking about our way of managing the forest, without actually talking to us. And I think that's kind of like a very, very important critique, that much more we should actually listen to people on the ground and actually coming with these big international ideas that are then pushed onto people who have actually no idea what what it's going to be, what's going to happen, and who often also don't see many of the benefits because many of these conservation programs tend to be, as I would call it, desktop conservation, where you write lots of nice reports, you go to the field once in a while, but actually a lot of money is moving around in consultants and offices and administration, and very little actually goes to where it's probably most needed. And then, of course, you have these larger issues, and particularly in Colombia, looking at Plan Nacional de Desarrollo, where mining is like a really important driver of the economy in the future, supposedly. I think one needs to really be aware of the negative environmental and also social impacts of mining. So I've been in Ecuador where there is lots of like artisanal mining going on at small scale, but if we have 1,000 of these, of course, they also have an impact, not just on the forest, but also on the rivers and on the pollution. But also a study published last year in Brazil says like, well, if you have a mine, and people say like, oh, the mine is only like this big, it's very small. Well, actually there are indications that 70 kilometers around that mine, there is gonna be an environmental impact. There's roads, there's colonization, there's more people moving in. So the impact is much larger than actually what the mining area on paper covers. So mining drives a large amount of deforestation in the Amazon, much more than actually governments or many people actually think. So it's really important to take that into consideration. And then taking another step even further, looking at international trade flows. And I think this is really important to continue because we can talk about deforestation in Colombia, the same with, for example, the politics against narcotics in Colombia, if you don't address actually the drivers of this. Where is the market? Where people are buying that stuff? Where are people that buy beef from Brazil or soy or timber? Where does it go? So most of the deforestation policies that we see and people talk about it are actually much more, they're focusing on small regions or countries, but they usually never work with that because that's either just too inconvenient to talk about or it's too complicated or because there's other interests that kind of prevent these negotiations from happening. So is my last slide. Conclusions. So hunting, I think, and I hope you agree with me now after this talk, needs to be expressed a bit more explicitly or much more explicitly in any type of forest policies, forest governance across scales at the local level, but also at the national, international level. If we are to move forward with RED Plus, which is right now a bit like unsure whether RED Plus will be actually successful, whether it's going to move forward or not, it has to be included. We have to talk about hunting. I'm not saying that hunting is bad, but we have to talk about it and actually try to understand whether it can be sustainable and how can it be sustainable in the long run. We need to look at forests more from a social ecological systems perspective, not just as a certain land cover on a given piece of land. And we have to recognize people's knowledge, local knowledge, that is not necessarily academic or scientific, but it's equally important to actually take it into consideration. And if you don't do that, then I think there's a risk that we don't actually going to achieve sustainable, equitable forest governance in the long run. And that's actually a problem for the climate, it's a problem for many other ecosystem services we derive from tropical forests, but also for the resilience of these forests in the long run, which are going to be impacted by climate change. We don't know necessarily how they're going to be affected. That's it. So if you have any questions, shoot now. I think we have some time, or you can also, whenever you want to write me an email. This is my email address. And I just want to quickly acknowledge the people that I work with, and also the Swedish Science Foundation, who's provided me the financing. Thank you very much. There's microphones.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, muy interesante la presentación. En el fondo, el mensaje principal es un mensaje, si se quiere, contraintuitivo, que de alguna manera la prohibición de la caza puede ser contraproducente. Y el mecanismo que tú mencionas es un mecanismo interesante, y es que esa prohibición de la caza está acabando con una serie de creencias, si quiere, con una cosmovisión que era la que garantizaba la protección por las comunidades que habitan allí. Es como si los antropólogos tuvieran una visión mucho más aterrizada y fructífera de la conservación que los biólogos. La pregunta compleja es la de la economía política, porque como es contraintuitivo, las autoridades pueden temer entrar al debate. ¿Tú has tenido alguna conversación, has mencionado estos temas con quien toma las decisiones? ¿Qué opinan los tomadores de políticas públicas, ¿no? Porque hemos tenido ejemplos recientes, que lo hemos discutido una y otra vez, que es el del Caimán, donde se generan debates grandes. Yo no me imagino la noticia al día siguiente diciendo está permitida ahora la caza en el Amazonas y está permitida para proteger el Amazonas. Ese es un argumento interesante, complejo, donde necesitamos tener de alguna manera como una masa crítica, ¿no? Estar ahí. Entonces yo creo que esto es evidencia que nos ayuda a tener un diálogo más productivo con las autoridades.
Un comentario a eso.
Claro.
Mira, yo participé en la investigación con Natalie Van Fleet en Puerto Nariño. Y todo iba bien hasta que se habló con las autoridades. Y es que lo que parece contraintuitivo es por la visión que tenemos las autoridades. Tenemos una visión, digamos, urbana de Bogotá, no diversa. Y entonces este tema con Natalie Van Fleet y el grupo de trabajo se volvió casi de no hablar más de eso, de no firmar la segunda parte del convenio con el Instituto Humboldt que yo facilité y nos fuimos a la discusión académica. Yo diría que lo que termina siendo contraintuitivo en el fondo es que Colombia es un país diverso y no nos hemos dado cuenta, de diversidad cultural y no nos hemos dado cuenta. Ese era mi comentario. Y una pregunta contraintuitivo para nosotros, ¿no? Aquí arriba y de frente a Monserrate y todo eso, ¿no? Digo, espaldas a... ¿Cómo es que dicen? Bueno.
Yo creo que el argumento más importante y el que sí tiene que tener algún eco es que en el fondo la casa es necesaria para garantizar una cultura y esa cultura es necesaria para garantizar cierta conservación. Y yo creo que nosotros tenemos como académicos, como sociedad civil, como todos, ser capaces de presentarle esa visión al país y salir un poco de la indignación barata que se parece a la indiferencia de todos los días, ¿no?
Sí, claro, no, es interesante.
Acá, gracias. Voy a hacer un comentario y una pregunta también ahí. Primero que me alegra mucho ver que sea en una economía, creo que estudia la mayoría. ¿Sí? ¿Biólogos hay acá? Aparte de mí. Si hay algunos por ahí. Bien, súper. Que sea una discusión que está dentro de ese sistema. Y es la misma retrospectiva. Yo estudio biología acá y estudio antropología acá, pero las conversaciones después de la maestría en conservación no tiene uno con quien conversar ni en biología ni en antropología aquí en la universidad. Tal vez sea con los de economía. Y pues con... Sí. Y con gusto te describiré, también trabajé en el Baupés con sistemas de cacería y con mucha alegría poder cambiar esa transición desde los ambientalistas en Bogotá defendiendo el delfín, la danta, cuando uno llega a la selva y la mayor alegría que uno puede tener, casi que uno empieza a ver en colores otra vez y respira más grande después de meterse un bocado de danta. Porque vivir en la selva es durísimo. El cuerpo está todo el tiempo está sudando, luchando contra infecciones, contra mil cosas, y comerse un bocado de carne es de lo mejor que le puede pasar a uno. Entonces, una de las cosas que más he visto, y quiero unirlo, el tema de educación en la ciudad y el tema de educación en las comunidades, ese creo que es un punto crucial, es la diversidad de pensamiento, ¿no? Cuando nos definimos economistas y se nos olvidó que la economía, si acaso, es la base de la biología, o viceversa, ¿no? Una economía biológica. Y un biólogo, pues también tiene que ser un buen antropólogo. Entonces es la diversidad de pensamiento en la que nos creímos de una disciplina y no de otra. Y en las comunidades, pues es muy complejo porque desde hace mucho tiempo, las misiones fueron la estrategia de domesticación y de homogenización de pensamiento. Ya digamos que las misiones todavía hay, pero digamos que ya hay proyectos interculturales, educación propia, etnoeducación, con todas sus problemáticas, pero sigue habiendo el problema en el que momento en que solo hay un centro escolar que tiene desde los pequeñitos hasta los grandes, me toca irme, se rompe el lazo papá y mamá, cambio mi dieta porque tengo que comer lo que me dan en el internado, mis costumbres sexuales cambian también porque entonces estoy lejos de mis papás, estoy con 20 amiguitos míos en el internado al lado, como lo que me toca, se rompe todo, entonces pareciera que otra vez una contradicción ahí sí, que el esfuerzo por educar o por ofrecer educación es una misma punta de lanza para romper la diversidad cultural, y yo creo que ese es de los retos principales en conservación integral de biodiversidad, si no es abordar la educación. No sé cómo abordarlo desde aquí, desde los Andes o desde las universidades. Es el proyecto educativo. ¿Qué hacemos para no tener que forzar a los pelados a ir al centro más cercano de educación, sino pensar en una cosa distinta? No sé si tú has pensado algo en eso.
Bueno, sí.
Hola. Una cortica. Gracias. No, quería comentar que había al principio estabas hablando acerca del tema de los drivers que promueven la cacería y queríamos traer a colación un trabajo que nosotros hicimos en el Ecuador con un modelo de producción de hogares para identificar los drivers de la cacería, que lo hicimos, fue un trabajo que hicimos con un ecólogo que estuvo pues haciendo toda la recolección de información de campo y encontrábamos, después de hacer el modelo de producción de hogares, encontrábamos las elasticidades, precio de la demanda y precio de la oferta de algunos bienes usados en la cacería, y encontrábamos que de las cosas más determinantes en la conducta de extracción, pues está el monto de las penalidades probables por si son capturados cazando ilegalmente, el precio de la comercialización de la carne, y algo muy importante, los costos asociados a los materiales necesarios para cazar. ¿Sí? Si son escopetas, entonces las balas o lo que necesite para hacer la cacería. Pero además encontramos que hay una sustitución muy directa. O sea, estas elasticidades pueden afectar la cantidad total de... No, perdón. Pueden afectar la cantidad total de carne vendida, pero no necesariamente la cantidad total de caza, porque la caza también tiene un papel importante en términos de seguridad alimentaria. Entonces, si el hogar no puede vender la carne, pues lo sustituye alimentándose de esa carne. Sí. Entonces hay ciertas relaciones ahí que ya empiezan a ser como más evidentes para la discusión.
Pues muy corto para... Sí, yo creo que vi allá, como la gente está pensando, obvio, están pensando en el costo-beneficio. Si yo vivo muy lejos, tengo que gastar como 4 galones para llegar al puerto nariño para vender la carne, no voy a llevar como una boruga chiquita. Lo hago cuando tengo un pecarí y cuando tengo una lanta. Pero también me parece muy interesante que no hay una distinción entre qué carne es. Como cualquier carne tiene el mismo precio. Si es costilla, si es brazo, si es 1 kilo vale 10.000 o 12.000 por ahí en Puerto Nariño. Aquí es un poco más caro. Entonces no hay diferencia. Como la carne es carne. Si es carne buena...
La especie sí.
¿Ah?
La especie sí.
No, una lanta vale lo mismo que un pecarí vale lo mismo como 1 kilo de boruga. No hay una diferenciación entre especies, que me parece muy interesante, porque hay algunas especies que son más sabrosos o son más difíciles a conseguir, deberían ser más caros, ¿no? En la economía que pensamos, pero no son. Pues ahí no hay, no sé, la gente dice que yo solamente voy cuando tengo suficiente para cobrar como que voy a gastar, la gasolina, la bala, lo que sea, pero también dicen que cuando no es suficiente yo luego me como. Solamente voy a comer lo que necesito y pues la gente piensa, pero no hay una distinción entre el precio. Pero es muy interesante, si quizás me puedes mandar un estudio que hicieron en Ecuador, será súper bueno. Para hablar de educación, no, me han contado mucho. Yo trabajando con Oderico, que un problema muy grave para que los jóvenes ya no quieren quedarse en los resguardos, para que se quieren ir a Bogotá o para que quieren estudiar, es porque hay internados y hay como mucha educación del occidente, ¿no? Ya está cambiando, hay como escuelas donde están enseñando idioma indígena, como un poquito más, pero también son lejos. Pero eso son, pues la infraestructura es difícil, no puedes poner una escuela en cualquier comunidad que está tan lejos. Se podría, pero es muy difícil, pero toca pensarlo. Y también yo hablaron mucho sobre el tema de alimentación en los internados. Dijeron la alimentación es pésima. Como hay los contratistas pues, del Estado que se roban la mitad de plata, lo que llega es un huevo y un poco de arroz y pues embutidos. Nada a ver con la comida tradicional. Y no solamente es malo para el cuerpo, también es malo porque ya rompe, como dijiste, rompe como la conexión que tienen los niños con su entorno, con la naturaleza. Y ahí tienen una propuesta en Puerto Nariño que quieren que la carne que van a vender lo venden a las escuelas para sustituir la mala calidad de la comida que entregan ahí. Me parece muy interesante, muy importante, toca hablar de eso. Pero hay como la política del Estado que pues prohíbe eso en este momento, ¿no? Y creo que yo hablé con un señor hace rato del Consejo Internacional y él me dijo que pues yo digo que en Colombia a mí me parece muy difícil entender las leyes. Hay leyes acá, hay decretos aquí y allá. Yo como no soy abogado, entonces, ¿cuál es la ley que tengo? ¿No? Y dijo que pues eso pasa porque acá hay muchas leyes que sacan todo el tiempo, está cambiando todo el tiempo, pero lo más fácil por cualquier estado es prohibir. Si yo no estoy seguro cómo manejarlo, lo prohíbo. La prohibición es lo más fácil, porque está prohibido ya, todos sabemos que está prohibido, no se puede vender la carne en el monte. Pero como yo he mencionado, que cuando se prohíbe es muy difícil saber qué pasa, porque todavía pasa. Todos sabemos que hay un mercado de carne de monte, eso es obvio, que ya hay estudios. Muy difícil saber y también como ya es muy difícil entrar a una discusión cómo podríamos hacerlo legal cuando estamos seguros que se puede manejar de una manera que es sostenible. Y ahí entran los biólogos, pero también sabemos muy poco sobre la ecología de fauna tropical. No hay mucho hay conocimiento, pero creo que falta mucho para entenderlo muy bien cómo están las relaciones ecológicas para decir, pues, en una hectárea se puede cazar una oruga por mes. Esos son los números que se necesitan para hacer como una política bien, pero eso no hay, no existe. Y hasta los mismos indígenas dicen que no sabemos cuándo los animales están en temporada de gestación. Cambia todo el tiempo, entonces no se puede decir, hay una veda entre marzo y junio. Algunos sí, pero está cambiando. Dicen que andan todo el tiempo con crías. Entonces, creo que falta mucho a entender, a saber, para llegar a un punto donde se podría manejar una cacería sostenible que sea legal. Creo que pues ahora creo que en muchos lugares en Colombia todavía es sostenible. ¿Por qué? Porque hay muchos lugares que son tan lejos que nadie va, que son una reserva. Entonces, si hay sobrecaza en las comunidades, pues los animales llegan de allá. Eso ha salvado la fauna en Colombia y en algunas partes del Amazonas. En el Ecuador, muy diferente, porque allá no hay tantas áreas tan grandes. Hay muchas comunidades en una presión muy grande de población, hay mercados, hay más fácil comunicación, hay muchas áreas donde ya no hay estas reservas tan grandes, tan importantes. Entonces, esto depende. Pero creo que lo más importante es abrir un poco la puerta, hablar con los conservacionistas, los biólogos, el Estado mismo, los abogados, para no solamente decir la cacería es mal, que pasa muchas veces.
Yo iba a hacer una pregunta, pero creo que ya lo dejo como comentario porque no tenemos tiempo, y es en tu idea de incorporar el conocimiento tradicional, en el cual seguro es sin duda un elemento importante en gobernanza, pero en Colombia hemos llegado como a unas propuestas, a mi modo de ver, bastante difíciles de operacionalizar. En la ley de pagos por servicios ambientales en Colombia el año pasado quedó escrito que se puede pagar por servicios culturales, es decir, por conocimiento tradicional, lo cual es un poco absurdo porque vamos a pagar por el pagamento, por el baile de la maloca, no, con este tema pagar por servicios ecosistémicos para conservación en el marco de red, quedó metido el conocimiento tradicional, que me parece, pues, cuando menos, digamos, éticamente ni siquiera me quiero meter ahí, pero operativamente absurdo, ¿no? No sé si, digamos, como ese extremo de buscar cómo meter el conocimiento tradicional queda metido donde no debería meterse. Bueno, creo que no no tenemos tiempo de continuar, entonces muchas gracias.
Gracias.